So I am pleased to welcome Will Adler and Emma Llansó from the Center for Democracy and Technology. Emma is the director of their Free Expression Project, which covers a very wide range of topics, everything from disinformation to online abuse, to privacy, and so she'll get more into that, and is a great resource on those issues. Will is the senior technologist focused on elections, and so he will be able to speak to kind of security around 2022 and beyond, really. So I'm going to shut up and I will let Emma take it from here. So thank you both for coming.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for having us here. So my name is Emma Llansó, and a little bit of background about CDT. So CDT is a nonprofit advocacy organization based just down the street at 1401 K Street. We also have a small office in Brussels, and we focus on all sorts of issues having to do with civil liberties and human rights in internet and technology, law and policy. So across CDT, we cover a lot of different topics: freedom of expression, commercial data privacy, government surveillance. We have a team of technologists. We work on kind of equity and civic technology issues and how government is using technology and the effect that has on, for example, students in schools. So we really try to take a wide range at a lot of different types of technologies and understand how they impact the full sort of suite of human rights and civil liberties online. In our free expression team, we work on all things having to do with access to information and opportunities to speak online. So it's a lot of work around intermediary liability law and policy, like Section 230 here in the US, or the Digital Services Act over in Europe. The laws that basically set out what legal responsibility online intermediaries have for the content that their users post, and how that sort of shapes everything from who has an opportunity to have an account on Twitter to what kind of news sites and services can be created, and who is responsible when things like terrorist propaganda or disinformation or child sexual abuse material appear online. A lot of my work has to do with advocacy at Congress around legislation that they're considering. We also do a lot of work in the courts, and a lot of advocacy directed at tech companies around their content moderation, terms of service, and transparency reporting, and really trying to get companies to do, whether it's required by law or not, to do better by their users in as far as addressing abuse online and protecting users' rights. So disinformation has been a huge topic in all of these conversations for the past at least 6 or 7 years now. And we've done a variety of different things at CDT kind of on the topic of disinformation. In the 2020 election, we were really trying to look at what would sort of targeted advice to elections officials and other kind of public officials around the role they could play in countering disinformation online. And we were really focused in particular around what we sort of called voter suppression misinformation. So that's information about kind of where and how to vote, especially in 2020. It was sort of a lot of people's first time thinking about voting by mail or filing an absentee ballot, or going through different voting procedures than just showing up at their local polling place and casting their vote on election day. So we, together with another organization called the CTCL, Center for Tech and Civic Life, yes, put together a training for elections officials, really looking at what role they can play as sort of authoritative sources of that information. You know, if anybody in a state is going to know the date and time of the election, it better be the election official, and that they can play a role kind of filling things like data voids, making sure that there is accurate information available in all of the languages that voters in their areas might speak, so that they can kind of, as a way to obviously not fully solve the problem of disinformation around when and how to vote, but make sure that there is kind of reliable information out there for people to have access to. Since the 2020 election, we've also been doing some research into how, in particular, women of color political candidates experience disinformation online. So we will have a report coming out in mid-October, but I can tell you a little bit about it before it comes out, looking at both kind of qualitative interviews, so research interviews with about a dozen women of color political candidates from 2020, as well as a number of their digital team and kind of social media managers to talk about their experiences as a candidate. What kinds of hate, harassment, abuse, and disinformation did they find targeted at them? And how they responded to it, what kinds of measures they either could put in place or what kinds of things they thought companies should do to make it easier for them to manage the kind of enormous amounts of really negative commentary and disinformation that were directed at them. And also some quantitative analysis looking at, in general, tweets directed at political candidates to understand sort of across different demographics, what were we seeing. At CDT, we thought this kind of research was really important to do because ultimately it goes into the question of who can actually represent people in our democracies. If you see, as we think we are finding, research to be published shortly, that there is kind of systematically worse disinformation and hate and harassment directed at women of color online. One, that's not going to shock anybody as a finding, but if we start tying that to people trying to participate as political candidates, trying to engage in representing people in our democracy, and we see sort of efforts to systematically exclude them from doing that by basically harassing them into silence, that has huge implications for kind of the health and the future of our representative democracy. So we do research like that, and then we also look more broadly at things that affect kind of content moderation and online information flows. Everything from research into what kind of automated technology can companies actually use to try to do content moderation, so natural language processing algorithms, image and video analysis, to try to understand what the capabilities and limitations of these different tools are and how that plays out in the kinds of policies or practices or efforts companies might put in place to try to address abuse or rein in disinformation. Happy to go deep down a rabbit hole on all that if people are interested in it. But then the final thing I'll say, and to flag, because I know a lot of you are really focused on Congress, is we also spend a lot of our time just looking at kind of what is the fundamental legal framework that all of this speech online in the US is built on top of, and the role of laws like Section 230 in setting the kind of intermediary liability baseline for online services to operate on. One thing we have seen a lot in the past couple of years are proposals, typically coming from the right, to try to kind of rein in companies' ability to moderate content that, for example, is not illegal. But that ends up really affecting what companies might be able to do to address things like hate speech or harassment or disinformation online, because the vast majority of that speech is probably protected by the First Amendment, is probably not illegal. And so if the liability regime changes so that a site like Facebook or Twitter or YouTube cannot remove content from a political figure, as a law in Florida was proposing, or cannot remove disinformation that is not illegal, is not fraud of some sort, then you're really starting to see a big threat to companies' abilities to take any steps against disinformation and hate and harassment online. So happy to dive into all of that, but first I wanted to pass over to Will to talk more about CDT's election security work and a lot of other things besides.
Sure, thanks. Hi, everybody. So I lead all of the work at CDT that has anything to do with like the nuts and bolts of how elections are run in the US. We do a little bit of international work as well. I've been at CDT about 2 years, so I started just before the 2020 election, so a pretty intense time to start getting into election security policy and things like that. But before CDT, I was working to advocate for redistricting reform to try to stop or prevent partisan gerrymandering. And then after that, I did a year as a fellow on the Hill in Elizabeth Warren's office. And it's great to be here talking with you guys because there's so many projects that I've done in all of those, all of these jobs where without, some incredible scoop or some really impressive story, piece of reporting from, many of the different organizations that you guys are at, without that reporting, there wouldn't have been a story or there wouldn't have been a project to do. So it's great to talk to you guys. A little bit of history about the elections program at CDT. It was really spun up in 2017. So right after all of the cyber attacks and all of the disinformation that the Russians did in 2016. So in 2016, Russian spies were, made an attempt, for instance, to try to access the computerized voter registration systems in every state, all 50 states. They were able to actually break into the non-public side of those voter registration systems in at least 2 or 4 states or something like that. There's no evidence that they were able to actually change any information in those databases, but they were able to access the non-public side, which is a really big problem. So this put a lot of attention on basic cybersecurity measures, given that elections are administered by about 8,000 different jurisdictions in the U.S. This is what makes elections in the U.S. just entirely different from almost every country, is that it's administered by 8,000 jurisdictions. Very few of those jurisdictions have full-time IT staff at all. There's really not very much security expertise in many of these local jurisdictions. So 2016 really made made all of these officials think, okay, I need to up my security, basic stuff like passwords, multi-factor authentication. And there was room for civil society groups like CDT to try to provide support to election officials, kind of like what Emma was describing with the training that we did on misinformation. But since 2020, the federal government has really stepped up its game on election security. So CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, was stood up in 2018, and one of their big missions is to help cybersecurity in areas of critical infrastructure, which include power generation, it includes hospitals, but it also includes elections. So CISA was stood up in 2018, and they've been doing a really good job helping election officials get better, get more secure, and 2020 ended up being a very well-run and very secure election. But obviously, one of the big lessons from 2020 is that an election can be really well-run and really secure, but if you have people with really big megaphones saying that the election was rigged or that there were huge security problems, and that misinformation spreads really quickly and people tend to believe it, then it might not matter how well run and secure it is. I mean, it matters, but it diminishes that hugely. So, since 2020, Trump and his allies tried to put pressure on election officials to overturn the election, to say that there were problems with the election. He also pressured state lawmakers to initiate basically bad faith post-election audits that were trying to basically dig up evidence that the election was rigged. So one project that we've been doing, and I just want going to give you a menu of 2 projects related to election security in addition to the projects that Emma talked about, so that you can have some ideas of questions, directions you want to take the conversation in. But one thing we've been working on is post-election audits. So post-election audits are one of the best ways that we know to accomplish a couple of objectives after an election is done. So one is just make sure that the outcome was correct, make sure that the ballots were counted properly, and try to provide really convincing public evidence. The idea is that the evidence should be so strong that the loser has to accept publicly that they lost, or they look very silly not accepting that. The evidence should be very compelling. So tabulation audits are one subset of post-election audits, which is basically you say, okay, we ran all these ballots through these electronic counting machines, but what if we just don't want to trust those counting machines, right? The counting machines are computers. It's possible that those computers are hacked. So let's do a tabulation audit. That tabulation audit could look like a full hand recount of the ballots. It could look like a partial hand recount of just a sample of the ballots, something like that. These audits are often done by the election officials themselves. But we saw in 2021 that the Arizona State Senate initiated this audit of the results in Maricopa County, Arizona. Maricopa County is the most populous county in Arizona. It's got about half the population of Arizona. And the Senate contracted with this contractor called the Cyber Ninjas, who had no experience with elections at all, to try to run this post-election audit that went on for, I think it went on for 4 to 6 months. So this contractor, this unqualified contractor, was given access to all 2 million ballots that were cast in Maricopa County. They were given access to all of the equipment, and they put it all in this stadium, and they had groups of people looking through the ballots and marking them with pens that were not approved to be on ballots, mishandling equipment, and so on and so forth. And it was basically, election observers basically said it was just a travesty. And ultimately, all the equipment that they looked at had to be decertified because the Secretary of State couldn't know that the machinery wasn't tampered with at great, so they had to replace that all at great cost to the taxpayer. And it's also used as part of this disinformation generating feedback loop, right? So there's disinformation about, was the election rigged? They do this audit, and then having the props of being we've looked at the equipment, we've looked at the ballots, and things seem really suspect, is a way of like generating further disinformation. So one thing that one project we're looking into, also a report that we're going to have out in October, is like what can be done about these kinds of audits. So obviously, election officials auditing themselves might not inspire like a great amount of confidence in people disinclined to trust the election officials. So there should be a role for independent auditors to look at this result. But unfortunately, there's no like obvious formal way to distinguish who a qualified election auditor is from a bad election auditor. So a lot of the reporting about this audit was, trying to explain to readers what distinguishes this CyberNinjas audit from like a regular audit, which is a really complicated, hard thing to do, right? There are some principles like professionalism, transparency, objectivity. You can explain all those things, but there's no simple way to be like, this is like an uncertified auditor, or this is a non-standard audit in the way that you would refer to like, well, that's an unaccredited college or like an unlicensed doctor, right? Those things, when someone says that, you know what that means. You're like, well, okay. So anyway, we're going to produce a report looking at policy options for how to better distinguish between good and bad post-election audits. And this is also going to apply to, there's been reporting lately on these breaches. So some of the same people who have been trying to initiate these audits have also convinced, and this is really recent reporting, but in like 2021 and 2022, they've been able to convince county officials basically to hand over their equipment for inspection, just to look at what's, did anything go wrong with this equipment? And that raises some of the same issues of like, who are these independent outsiders who are getting access to equipment? What are their qualifications? And what are the harms that this can cause? And then the second project that I want to talk about is we just released a report in June on ballot marking devices. So ballot marking devices are touchscreen computers in polling places that you can use to cast your vote. They print out a ballot. You're supposed to review the ballot before putting it in the scanner. There are a group of security experts who think that these machines should just not be used at all or should be limited to the maximum extent possible because they can be hacked. But getting rid of these machines is just not an option. It's not an option legally because the Help America Vote Act, which was passed by Congress in 2002 after the 2000 election, requires that all voters, including voters with various disabilities, be able to vote privately and independently. And these ballot marking devices are really the only way that we know how to provide disabled voters that option in a polling place. They're able to make the font size really big. They're able to use an auditory interface or a sip and puff interface, which is something that you can manipulate with your mouth in order to vote. And there's really no way around it. We need to have these machines, basically. So we have a report kind of laying out, well, what are the issues here? How can we make these machines better? How can we make them more secure? And things like that. Which points to a really interesting issue right now in election administration, which is just like how technophobic to be. There's basically like a right amount of technophobic to be in election administration. So for instance, there's calls to get rid of these ballot marking devices, but we have to have them. The question is just how many? How do we make them more secure? There are also calls lately from the, mostly the election denying crowd to get rid of electronic tabulation entirely. So move to only hand counts of ballots, which is a really wild idea, actually. So there are some countries where they do hand count all the ballots, but in many of those countries, the election is just, it's a parliamentary election where you just vote for your party. There's just one question on the ballot. And many of these countries have very low tech ballots, and then they count them all by hand. In the US, almost every jurisdiction has like tons of races on the ballot. So hand counting, a jurisdiction of ballots where the ballots are really complicated, where there's lots of different kinds of ballots that a voter might have, hand counting that is just impossible and actually might take weeks. So, and if you do that, there's all this disinformation. If the count takes too long, there's disinformation about how the count is going. And also hand counting is extremely inaccurate. So if you have people hand count complicated ballots, you often get errors like in the 1% range. Whereas like if you do electronic tabulation, the errors are down in the hundredths or thousandths of a percent range. So the calls to get rid of electronic tabulation entirely are pretty wild. And we do know the right way to do things. We know that we can do electronic tabulation and we can do post-election audits, good post-election audits that take samples of ballots and confirm the outcome. These are called risk limiting audits. This is something that we've been advocating for years. Some states have adopted them. It's really the best way to get the best of both worlds. So a really fast count, and then also a pretty comprehensive audit that tells you with a high degree of confidence whether that outcome was correct. Okay, so I'll stop talking there, but we've laid out kind of like a menu of different options and different projects, and I'm curious to hear what you want to talk about.
Who's first?
I don't have necessarily a specific question, but I know particularly I'm Daniel, I'm from the Kansas City Star, and so a bunch of my folks are, there's been a politicization of disinformation and that sort of issue going on to the point where the Missouri Attorney General is actually trying to sue the White House over he basically says that they're curbing the freedom of speech by colluding with social media companies. He and the Louisiana Attorney General working on that. And so I guess, how do you navigate this space as it's being politicized, as Republican politicians are really kind of going after the idea of moderation and of trying to limiting hate speech to some point where they kind of wear it as a badge of honor in their campaigns? I know one Republican I was covering, touted the fact that Twitter had suspended her because she had tweeted something transphobic, and she used that throughout the campaign almost as kind of a way to solidify her credentials in the Republican primary. So how are you navigating this kind of thing that wasn't political and now is very, very, very political?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I think there are a lot of different sort of environments where these discussions are happening. So one thing we're seeing a lot in Congress is just how, the effect of the intense politicization of content moderation affecting everything from how the antitrust bills are being negotiated to just last week, the JCPA, the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act, kind of all coming to a screeching halt in the middle of a hearing because Senator Cruz introduced an amendment about content moderation and Senator Klobuchar wasn't having it. So it is, politically, it is completely gumming up the works. It is meaning that for, so many of the different tech bills that are coming before Congress, whatever bipartisan agreement there is on parts of the bill can get really, really gummed up or totally evaporate when issues around content moderation come into play. And I don't know where that goes, right? Because it does seem like we've only in the past couple of years seen, for example, in different sort of Republican majority states like Florida or Texas, efforts to pass at the state level, bills that would limit companies' ability to do content moderation. And at the same time, we see from Democratic members or the administration a push for companies to do more on moderating disinformation about COVID or elections or all sorts of things. So the partisan divide is, in my view, like as stark as it's ever been. As an advocacy group, what CDT tries to focus on is one of our main asks for companies has always been more transparency about what they're doing and how they're operating. A report we published earlier this year actually looked at the question of shadow banning, and we did research. My colleague Gabe Nicholas did research with a variety of different folks from across the political spectrum who in survey responses were saying that they felt they had been victims of shadow banning. And we found a lot of different folks from different political backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, gender identity backgrounds, all having different stories of like, I think the companies are out to get me and my viewpoint. To us, that's a big message to the companies that they have to be a lot more transparent about like what are their policies, how are they enforcing them, when they do things like suppress content so that it doesn't show up as high in algorithmic rankings, because at this point, many users assume that that is happening and assume that that is a tool that is being used against them. And it might be that their content just isn't very good and people just don't want to see it. But because it's sort of that data void issue, because there's not clear information about a company of what they are doing, people can assume the worst. So I do think there is definitely a role for the companies to be kind of more clear and transparent about what they're doing. But there's also just a lot of trust that has already been lost of, will people even believe them when they put that information out? So it's not a great situation either on the political side or in the sort of user to company relationship side. I think it is where, one, we have to get better information out of companies. One big focus of research for CDT right now is on how do we actually make data held by private companies more accessible for independent researchers to access and to be able to do, whether it's academic researchers, journalists, civil society organizations. That to us is part of how we start rebuilding some of that trust, or building some trust around what's happening on platforms. If you can have independent voices and independent scholars examining, what are the impacts of different company processes on different demographics? What happens when a company rolls out a certain disinformation mitigation measure? Getting that out of independent researchers, I think, will hopefully be more convincing to more of the population. But even those bills get very politicized when they come up in Congress about who exactly are the researchers who will get access to this data. So we think there are some paths forward on the kind of research and transparency side, because right now there's just not a common set of facts about what is even happening with content moderation to have public policy discussions about.
Nice. My name is Ryan. I was wondering, how do you deal with, it seems like social media in many regards can be awash with disinformation and whatnot. Do you get the sense from social media companies that they are fully putting enough resources towards this issue, or is it more of a face value? We're addressing this. We know this is a big concern, but do you think that they are putting up enough resources to fully recognize and combat this issue, which is seeming to have just a lot of consequences in a lot of different areas? How do you feel about those ideas?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And again, it is hard for anyone outside of a company to really judge, because there's only so much that they tell us about how many resources, like what personnel, what kind of staffing, how close are they to the top to actually influence decision makers. We talk with plenty of people engaged in doing this work at companies who, as individuals, seem like they're doing it in the best faith and really trying to make a difference. But whether it actually shifts patterns of behavior overall on platforms is a lot harder to determine. I think Twitter has done some really interesting things with actually making more of their research and information about coordinated inauthentic behavior on their platform more public and more available for other researchers to look at too. Different companies have made some data kind of more easily accessible more recently, but it always kind of feels like those initiatives are sort of balanced on a knife's edge. And it's like, that's what the funding priorities and the policy team priorities are in this 6-month period, but what will happen, 6 months from now? I think one area where we definitely are hoping to see companies pay more attention is also in election disinformation in languages other than English. Here in the United States, there are lots of different languages, Spanish chief among them, that people are speaking on social media, and where different language communities are very much being targeted and exploited with disinformation about elections, about COVID, about all sorts of things. And we know both from our own research and talking with many advocates across the country and around the world that companies' content moderation in languages other than English is even less satisfying than what a lot of people experience in English language. So there are many different things social media companies could be prioritizing to try to address some of these issues. It's another place where I think research comes into it. What should their priorities be? Should it be focusing on kind of natural language processing tools that can understand English and Arabic and different languages across the US? Is it trying to have, putting more into fact checking? Are the different fact checking initiatives that different companies have rolled out effective and making a big difference? Some of these are empirical questions that should feed into the resource prioritization. It's a really, I think, important dynamic to understand. And I guess for me, it's looking at, there seems to be that sort of business model incentive for companies to keep attention, keep eyeballs, at least for some companies. Some services don't operate that way at all. Like a Wikipedia or even a Reddit isn't necessarily in that same like ad delivery business model with those same sort of dynamics of one social media feed. So there's that incentive, but there is also a lot of scrutiny, including from policymakers and regulators around the world, and especially in Europe, on kind of how are they addressing things like disinformation, systematic abuse, and harm. There's a regulation in Europe that just passed, the Digital Services Act, that it's still about 18 months from coming fully into force, but Europe is really gearing up through something called the Code of Practice on Disinformation, to actually put some pretty serious obligations on all of these same companies, on Google, Facebook, Twitter, all of these same social media companies that we think about here in the US have huge markets in Europe and will be complying with this regulation some way or another. And so that is also something I think for people who focused on kind of the US situation, just be aware of, in particular Europe, but also the United Kingdom, how much laws that they and their parliaments are passing much more quickly than Congress is, are really going to start shaping company practice. One area where I think you can see that is about a year ago, the United Kingdom rolled out their age-appropriate design code bill, which is targeted around a lot of different obligations for social media companies and other services around how kids use those services. And you might have noticed in the past year that there have been an awful lot of announcements from all the major social media services about, we'll help you figure out how much screen time you're using, we'll help you put limits on how often you access our app, we'll let you sort your feed chronologically if that's what you really want. A lot of folks trace that back to the obligations that they now have under this UK law. And I think that's something that here in the US around disinformation, we can also kind of expect to start seeing as different parts of the world regulate the issue. The total freedom of companies to just pursue a business model, to just pursue one set of incentives, is really starting to get constrained, if not by US policymakers, then by folks overseas.
And I just want to add a little bit to the first question about, are the companies devoting enough resources, if I can. So it's hard to know, right? Like Emma was saying, it's hard to know how much resources they're devoting to enforcing their policies, because they're not even transparent about that, right? So, one really good example of this is that, many of these companies have pretty comprehensive civic disruption policies, right? So like we're going to take down, or we're going to slow down, or otherwise label content that casts doubt upon a civic process or aims to disrupt a civic process or something like that. But then in January of this year, I think CNN reported that Twitter stopped enforcing its civic disruption policy in March 2021. And just hadn't told anybody, right? So this isn't, of course, there's plenty of like stop the steal type activity still happening in March 2021. Election disinformation has like gotten integrated into the discourse, but Twitter had just stopped enforcing this and didn't tell anyone. It took reporters, almost a year to try to uncover that. There was another Washington Post report that said that Facebook had this policy where they were trying to, slow down these stop the steal groups for a little while, and then they basically just stopped in December, right? Which, there was a data-heavy Washington Post piece that showed the rise in these groups after Facebook decided to stop taking action, which the article sort of implies, was part of the lead up to January 6th. So, there are all these interesting questions, right? How do you enforce these policies? How many moderators do you have? What kinds of languages do they speak? How culturally fluent are these moderators? Things like that. When do elections start and end? That's a really interesting one. Like, when do you start enforcing your election policies, and when do you stop? Should you stop? So one thing that we've seen that's kind of interesting is there's been this new model for doing or getting involved or having some oversight on content moderation with disinformation, whether it's elections or whether it's with COVID. So there are these kind of third-party partnerships between academics, civil society, researchers, platforms, fact-checkers, journalists. One really interesting one is the Election Integrity Partnership, which was run by the Stanford Internet Observatory, as well as some researchers from the University of Washington. They're running again for the midterms. They have a related project on COVID called the Viral Misinformation Project. And these groups are, trying to monitor the kind of disinformation that's happening online, try to track narratives, report it to the platforms, see if the platforms take action. And it's kind of interesting to think, well, what are these groups trying to do? Are they trying to sort of fill the gap because the platforms aren't doing enough to stop misinformation? Many of the groups feel like that isn't a role that they should have to play. They're like, I shouldn't be doing this. The platform should be doing a better job. But, you can imagine that there's also an oversight role, right? So you need to have groups like this sort of checking the work of the platforms. But again, there's this issue with like having visibility into what's happening on any given platform, researcher access to data, that makes this kind of thing really complicated, even though it is so important.
Hello, my name's Matt. I'm a reporter with Washington Post. First question would just be, how do you all keep track of all of the different election systems that you all outlined at the beginning? Like, I live in Atlanta, I cover elections down there, and there's a lot of different counties. So how do you all keep like just your head on all the different different policies that could be going on, different strategies that everyone's implementing, when literally you can cross a county line and suddenly you have an entirely different election system? And then my second question would be, we've talked about, audits and all the different crazy audit stuff going on. We've talked about Russians interfering in 2016. When we talk about threats to democracy, which one do you think all is in 2022 the bigger issue? Threats to election security, foreign or domestic, from elected actors, from just a crazy person who's going to throw out a box of ballots? Like, what's your perspective on, or all of the above? I don't know. How do you guys think about that?
Sure. So to answer the first question, it's really tough. There's so many different rules. I'm Googling stuff all the time. NCSL, the National Conference of State Legislatures, is a really fantastic resource. They spend a ton of energy trying to sort out, what are the different rules for some arcane election procedure in such and such state, in such and such county. Actually, not county. I think they just do keep things at the state level. And that's a really useful source. They keep them up to date. There's a little date up at the top so you can know how recently updated that resource is, and so on. As for what seems to be the most imminent threat in 2022, I mean, it's really hard to say. Like, in 2020, there were not really significant foreign attacks. There was a pretty weak Iranian combo attack and disinformation campaign that like really didn't have much of an impact, partly because the federal government responded really quickly. That doesn't necessarily mean that like 2022 or 2024 is going to be like, as easily avoid a foreign disinformation or actual, attack on election integrity. But I would still say that I think like the domestic threats are greater. So, for instance, Steve Bannon on his podcast has been trying to recruit people to get involved in election administration at a local level. There's been a similar there have been similar calls to get people to get involved in like school board elections as well. But I think like the idea that people who are motivated by misinformation about 2020 are now getting involved in actually running elections. There have been recordings that have come out lately of people being like, it's okay to cheat, like it's okay to do this to try to bias the election. Now that we have like lots of people who are, getting involved in elections, like almost entirely motivated by false information, I think that's really dangerous. But I think it has a potential to be even worse in 2024 because right now, in this election, we have election deniers, election skeptics, people who have campaigned on this, running for Secretary of State in a number of states. So the GOP nominee in Nevada, Michigan, a couple other states, the nominee for governor in Pennsylvania who appoints the Secretary of State, all these people have said 2020 was rigged. And it's scary to think about what someone who's campaigned on that might do to try to change how elections are run in their state in 2024. So I think that's one of the biggest threats is who's running in 2022 and what kind of power they'll have in 2024 to affect an election. It's pretty crazy when you think about it, and it's a massive conflict of interest in the U.S. that elections are run by partisan elected officials. There's really not that many countries in the world that do things like that. And mostly we've escaped unscathed pretty much. Like there haven't been crazy partisan actions taken by any of these officials running an election, with a few notable exceptions. Like 2018, Brian Kemp was Secretary of State administering his own election for governor. He definitely did some questionable things in that year, but most secretaries of state have been pretty neutral and pretty unbiased in their administration. And I don't know if we're going to be so lucky in 2024.
Sophia. Hi, Sophia with Axios. I wonder, so I'm very interested in this issue of on the flip side of this, gendered violence, mostly online against women running in politics, and up until probably the insurrection, or if you remember, AOC was this her encounter on the steps of Capitol Hill, and followed by the insurrection when like a lot of women were targeted and started talking about it. Like before that, it wasn't something that women who were already in seat or are running would really talk about, but it's different now, and we just saw like reporting about Jayapal's, threats and outside her house. But what do you think is going to be like the product of like what seems to be like a more public like and more forthcoming like group of women and others and marginalized groups like? And my second question related is like, how do you assess the federal government's like preparedness for the threats that you talked about, whether it's domestic in 2022 or 2024? Like, I know we've got like, in terms of foreign threats, the Global Engagement Center at the State Department, they seem to be doing some stuff, but like, how is that going? Like, what is your assessment there?
Yeah. Well, I can take the first one and maybe Will the second one. So yes, it is good to see more people able to kind of come forward about the hate and harassment that they're facing online and facing as political candidates. Horrible that it's happening, but I think a positive shift to see more kind of public discussion of that. Certainly one of the reasons that CDT is doing the research that we're doing on women of color political candidates is to really try to help bolster and put some empirical data behind this phenomenon, and to kind of acknowledge that it's happening, and to document the ways in which it really is corrosive to what we think of as having a representative democracy. If you have particular demographics systematically excluded from participation, you're never going to have representativeness.
Like every single Black woman I've spoken to who has like run during the pandemic, when all of their like activities were, they like every single one of them has been Zoom bombed, meaning like a group of people in a coordinated way have like come into their Zoom rooms and used like the N-word among other like derisive language.
Yeah. And so one that is horrible and also doesn't surprise me based on the research that we've done and the different folks that we've talked to as well. And I think like, where does this go from here? One is having more public conversation about it. There's always the risk of the Streisand effect. Does it direct more kinds of hate or harassment or disinformation at different candidates as people kind of hear about it and get the idea? I don't put much stock in that because I think it's happening so pervasively already. And instead, what I think it does is, one, help people understand that this is happening so that like a broader group of people, including people who don't experience it directly, can understand that it's a problem and indicate that they don't think it's okay. Get companies to understand more just how serious of a problem this is, and be more responsive to whether it's the addressing kind of hate and harassment in general on their services, but also in particular, like talking with candidates, understanding what are the actual kind of tools and resources that they need and that they have felt they need in the moment or as they're setting up a campaign or launching a campaign. A lot of candidates have a lot of ideas about like, if I had just had X, it would have been helpful. If I had been able to not look at my replies myself, but have a trusted third party go through them to make sure there weren't death threats, that would have made me more able to kind of participate online, be more comfortable opening up my social media app and posting content. A lot of different ideas of what companies could do to actually kind of provide these particularly vulnerable users tools and responsiveness to problems that they're facing that would enable them to participate more. One of the challenges is trying to think like, is there a role for the law in any of this? What could, and there are probably updates to online harassment laws, but at a certain point we run into the First Amendment and the kind of the challenge Congress would have in, for example, the Supreme Court has held that most approaches to hate speech laws in the US are just going to violate the First Amendment of the Constitution. And if that's the baseline, then there's some limit to what Congress could do. And that's why part of why we focus a lot of our attention on what could companies be doing to address more of this abuse, ultimately so that more people can operate more freely online.
It's a tall order.
And
I said it's a tall order.
It's a very tall order, yeah.
And as to your question about how do we assess whether the federal government is doing enough to adequately protect elections? I mean, the big one with election security is just money. Do election officials feel like they have enough money to operate? So unlike everything that Emma works on, election security is actually a problem that can be fixed by throwing a bunch of money at it. There's, if you think about like how often you do like a security update on your computer, right? You get an important security update like every week, every couple of weeks. A lot of election administration is computerized. There are computerized voter registration systems, voting machines, ballot tabulators. Many of these are computers that are running on deep underneath like a version of Windows from 2002 that's like running on Pentium 3s, and the software hasn't been updated in 10 years because to update the software, you have to get approval from the federal government and you have to get the vendors to sign the stuff, and it costs a lot of money to go through that whole process. Election officials are just woefully underfunded. Congress hasn't provided nearly enough money to election officials. In 2020, Mark Zuckerberg provided $350 million, which was administered by the Center for Tech and Civic Life, who we partnered with on the trainings that Emma mentioned, distributed all this money to these officials in order so that they could get the systems they needed to run an election during COVID, right? Mail ballot sorters and things like that. In response, there were all sorts of conspiracy theories about like Mark Zuckerberg trying to take over elections. The shorthand for this is Zuckerbucks. And in response, many state legislatures passed laws banning the use of any private donations for election officials. And in many cases, they did that without providing funds that would make up for the reason that those private foundations have to give money in the first place. So there's this, this is just even increasing the role that state legislators and Congress have in trying to provide money to actually run elections. So that's a big one, is just like, how much are counties like running a deficit, running understaffed, and so on. But the second way I would assess like whether the federal government is doing enough in terms of the disinformation threats and things like that is just looking at their involvement in coordinating information among election officials and among security officials. There are and should be limits to like how the federal government can intervene with election disinformation for many of the reasons that Emma brought up. But there are also groups. One is called the EI-ISAC, so EI-ISAC. And this is a group that's run by the Center for Internet Security, which is a nonprofit, and they try to coordinate election officials from all levels, local, state, and federal. The platforms are involved there, just so like as a narrative starts spinning up, they can kind of like coordinate, try and figure out what is the origin of this. Is this a foreign originating narrative? What can be done about it? And I think it'd be really great to actually, if you wanted to look into that and do some reporting on like, do people feel like the EI-ISAC do county officials, state officials feel like the EI-ISAC is sufficient? Are there ways they could be improved? I actually haven't seen any reporting on it, and I don't really know how well it's working. So, and I'd love to.
Kirk Beta with National Journal, and I had a follow-up with that. Like, if you guys could just design your own federal bill to strengthen election security, what would you prioritize? Is it just throwing a bunch of money at these different administrators? Is it federalizing, the administration of elections? Like, if you just could go carte blanche here, what would be on that wish list?
I mean, the two big ones are ones that some people in Congress have been pushing for a while, which is, the big one is money to replace systems. But the other big one is risk limiting audits on every single election. So risk limiting audits are this really cool technique where basically if you want to confirm the outcome of an election, you just have to look at a sample of ballots, and the number of ballots that you look at is dependent on how big the margin is. So basically through some math and some statistics, if you have an election that's like, 70-30 or something like that, you might only need to randomly draw like 100 ballots and look at them, and then you can confirm the outcome and say, like 95% chance that this is the right outcome, and we can like stop there or something like that, or 99. So what's cool about risk limiting audits is that you can, because they're so efficient and so cheap to run, you can do it on every single contest, right? But the problem is that to be able to do a risk limiting audit, you need to be able to sample ballots specifically. So you need to say, okay, I need to get that ballot over there, that ballot over there, that ballot over there. You can't just take every ballot in like a particular precinct or something like that. So in order to run an audit like this, the election official has to actually change the way that they store ballots, change the way that they keep track of ballots, and so on. And so I think that if there was a federal law requiring risk limiting audits and requiring election officials to do that, I think that would be really great.
So you brought up audits a couple of times. I was curious, like, do you have evidence or something that you can point to that shows that it's actually kind of changing the minds of voters, given the fact that people are just kind of going on vibes when they say that they feel like the election is stolen? Like, have you been able to kind of empirically prove that the more you do this, the more that people believe you? Because I don't know. Every time I write that there's no evidence of that the 2020 presidential election is stolen, I get plenty of emails from readers trying to point to this conspiracy and that conspiracy and that conspiracy. Literally every time I write it.
Yeah, I don't think that there has been any empirical research on that, and I think it would be really great because it is an assumption of most people in the election security community that if we like get the actual evidence out there, that it will make a difference. I think you're right to be skeptical about that assumption. I think the hope is that if there's even a group of like 3% of people who who are in a camp where like they could be convinced if the evidence is there and is presented properly and presented in a convincing way and through the right outlets and through the right spokespeople. I think even if that's like a small percentage of people, I think that's like a huge win, right? So, I mean, that's sort of how I feel about it. I don't know how big that camp is. I'm not sure how one would set about going to measure that. But I think the idea is, I think many people feel like elections are, in many cases, are not being properly audited, right? So like you are being asked to trust the tabulators and trust the election officials. So I think, it's possible that fundamentally, if there were a better way to make it so independent auditors could actually look at this, and present the real evidence, like we did an audit in this way, and we have such and such confidence that the election was correct. I think it's important to actually have those facts there. That's just a starting point before like, okay, how do we present those facts to people who are inclined to be ultra skeptical? I think you're right that there's always going to be like possibly now always a huge number of people who will just never be convinced of an election where they don't like the results, right? I think that just might be where we are now. But if there's even just a small portion of convincible people, I think it's worth it.
Yeah, and to Will's point of the audits are what can help give us that factual baseline, but then like so many other ways of fighting disinformation, we have to you need that factual foundation to build on, and then it's about finding out who are interlocutors or sources of authority that are actually convincing to the group who believes the false information, that can share that information. What are ways of presenting it? What are the motivations behind the disinformation that they're hearing? And can you address those kind of fundamental underlying concerns? But we need things like audits to get to that point of, much like we know the world is round. Like it's basically a sphere. And we know that. And there are still people who think that the world is flat, but we need that fact to even be able to begin trying to convince them. And we know it's not just enough that the fact exists. But without it, then it really devolves into a, like, my opinion is this, your opinion is that. And we know we're never going to convince anybody that way.
Hi, I'm Candace with the 19th. I think at one point you talked about how, I'm paraphrasing, but the ideal is like speed plus accuracy, and the longer it takes, people can have more doubts about what's going on. I'm wondering, I don't know enough about ranked choice voting as how they tabulate everything, but I've written about it a couple times, and just curious if that complicates the work that you do with like audits and yeah.
So that's a great question, because I just wrote a blog post 2 weeks ago about how ranked choice voting tabulation doesn't have to be slow. So there is this misconception that ranked choice voting inevitably leads to delays in knowing who the result is. So just as some background for people who don't know, ranked choice voting is a method of voting where rather than just selecting one candidate, you rank your favorite candidates. In the first round, if there isn't one candidate who's won a majority of first choice votes, then the candidate who received the least number of votes is eliminated, and then the people who voted for that person first, their vote then goes to their second choice candidates. So it's a little bit like doing a runoff election between the top candidates, except people don't have to come back for the runoff election, and there's always a humongous drop off in turnout for runoff elections. So anyway, ranked choice voting is a really great reform, but people think that it might slow down the results, which isn't necessarily true. So one reason people might think this is because in Alaska, which just had they just implemented a really interesting ranked choice voting system this year, and they just held a special election a few weeks ago, and they decided not to tabulate the results until all of the absentee ballots were in. And so the election was held, and they were releasing first choice results, which didn't tell you who won because no one won more than 42%. But they were going to wait 2 weeks before actually tabulating the results. This was not what people recommended. This was not the best practices identified by groups like Fair Vote or the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, which are these civil society organizations that are expert in ranked choice voting. It's possible to just tabulate the results. If you're scanning the ballots as they come in, it's possible to just tabulate the results immediately and see who comes in first. And then you can just update that as ballots come in, just like you would with any other kind of election. But sorry, I got a little bit sidetracked. Your question was about ranked choice voting and
yeah, I don't know. I just wanted to hear your thoughts about that, and because I covered the Alaska race, so
Okay.
I was just curious if it had to be that long. And in terms of doing audits, is it similar?
It's so as far as doing audits is harder with ranked choice voting. So doing like a hand count, for instance, like if you were to do like a full hand count of ranked choice voting election, it'd be pretty complicated because you're not just counting, right? Every individual ballot needs to be taken. The choices have to be recorded in full. So it's definitely more complicated. You have to involve computers more in the process. But also the math is a little bit different if you want to do a risk limiting audit, which is the kind of audit where you sample just a number of ballots. But long story short is that you can do risk limiting audits with ranked choice voting elections. It's just that they're a little bit harder to understand. The math is a little bit more complicated, but it's definitely doable. But yeah, the delay in Alaska was entirely a choice of the election officials there, right? They made it sound, they said things that made it sound like it was like required by law. They were like, well, there's a statutory deadline for the absentee ballots, so we're going to wait until the tabulation. But the statutory deadline for receiving absentee ballots says nothing about whether they could actually run the tabulation or not. They were just kind of, I think the fear from election officials is that if we rerun the tabulation as ballots come in, it's going to change who looks like is coming in first, right? And in a regular plurality election, that happens all the time, right? This happened in 2020, right? It looked like Trump was going to win an election, and then as more absentee ballots came in, Biden won. So that happens all the time in plurality elections. The difference with ranked choice voting is that what changes is what might change is not just who comes in first, but who gets eliminated. And I think the idea is that getting eliminated sounds really dramatic, and election officials don't want it to be changing over as ballots come in who gets eliminated. But I think that it's really just a voter education problem. I think like as voters get used to it, they tend to like voting with ranked choice voting, and they start to understand the system more because it's really not super complicated. So hopefully that, as people get used to it, election officials will get more comfortable with tabulating the results live.
Does anyone have a final question?
Are you all optimistic?
I'm nervous.
As a person, I'm optimistic generally. I don't know what to think for the election. The optimism I can find is that there are so many more people thinking about these issues, focused on these issues now, doing election monitoring of different sorts, monitoring for disinformation online, actual programs and projects stood up to look for foreign interference. We are better poised to at least fight some battles than we were 6 years ago. So that I think there has been some some sincere improvement there. But as as Will was talking about earlier, the kinds of disinformation that we are seeing and fighting now are markedly different. This is not covert, foreign government interference trying to mask itself and look like just regular Americans having opinions online. This is elected officials and high-profile people in their, fully under their public persona, saying things that are intended to undermine trust and faith in the elections, and that is a different ballgame. So maybe I'm talking myself into pessimism, but
yeah, it's really a different world, right? So like with 2016, the foreign attacks on election systems and the disinformation, those are bad enough, but like the take home from 2020 is that like we can do those kinds of attacks to ourselves now pretty well, and it's a different ballgame.
Heather and Will, thank you so much.
Thank you.